With the central banks printing trillions of dollars and debt running sky high, many want to know, how is this going to end? In this video, I'm going to give you a scenario that's picking up a lot of steam right now. I'm going to explain how it's been used before, and most importantly, what dangers and risks this poses for me and for you, and also what to watch out for. So stay tuned. All right, welcome back. If you are new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss. I like to talk about making money, investing money, and having overall success. It's especially important in times like this. If you like those types of topics, which I'm sure you do, click the like button. It helps other people see them, helps that algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel. Click that bell notification so you're notified every time I put new videos out. Now, today, we are living in two different Americas. We've been living in two different Americas where about the 40% of the wealthiest population, life's been pretty good. Over the last decade, asset prices have been going up, life's been good, but for the 60% at the bottom, it hasn't been so good. Consumer debt's been sky high, wages have been stagnant, been going down since the 70s. Most of them have no emergency funds. 40% of Americans couldn't come up with $400 for an emergency expense, and so forth. And we are watching in real time an unprecedented amount of debt being produced, being accumulated. I mean, we're seeing balance sheets completely explode. Central banks around the world are adding trillions of dollars. Just the Federal Reserve alone has added about $6 trillion just since this virus epidemic happened. And so it's led to many people asking, why not just default on the debt? Who is the money owed to? Why don't we just default on it? And there's a term that's being used that's starting to be thrown around, and the term is debt jubilee. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. So let me explain. So a debt jubilee basically comes from the Old Testament in the Bible. It's this old Hebrew law principle where it says that debts should be forgiven on the 7th year. So every 7th year, the debts would be forgiven. And then on the 49th year, all debts would be canceled, and any land that had been given away or sold would be reclaimed back to the original family. Slaves would be freed, etc. Now, some scholars that go back into the Bible say that maybe this never actually happened. I mean, it's in the Bible, but maybe it never actually happened where all that was canceled, and that's debatable. However, we do know that it has happened many times throughout our own history, and not even just in remote history, but even in modern times. So now, some of the past jubilees, we're going to hop in the time machine. You know, I love to go back in history and talk about this. So all the way back to 1792 BC, before Christ, we saw King Hammurabi of Babylon. He forgave all the citizens' debts that were owed to the government, high-ranking officials, and dignitaries. So this is about 1,800 years before Christ. Then in more recent terms, it's still pretty far back, but in 1300 AD, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed the first Christian Jubilee. We saw in 1841 in the United States, they put forth the Bankruptcy Act in the U.S., where before that got repealed, over 40,000 Americans had all their debt wiped out. We also saw it between 1932 to 1939, countries from all over the EU basically abandoned the gold standard, and they had to start writing off their liabilities. The average amount of debt written off during that time was about 20%, but it was a lot higher for more. France and Greece wrote off about 40 to 50% of their debt. In 1953, at the end of World War II, Germany had to wipe out a lot of debt. They used what's called the London Debt Agreement, and they wiped off so much debt it was about 280% of their GDP. And it keeps going. In the year 2000, there was actually a big movement called Jubilee 2000. If you remember the band U2, Bono from U2 was out there. He was the spokesperson. And basically the G8 countries got together and decided to forgive $100 million of debt to these lower income countries. In 2015, Croatia, the country of Croatia, wiped off debt for over 60,000 citizens. So you get the point. However, when we see American history, when we study American history and we look at the debt jubilee, we see it happens under unique, extreme political environments. I'm going to explain this to you because maybe you'll see some correlation to where we're at right now. So it happens in unique, extreme political environments. And I guess that's because a debt jubilee is a pretty radical measure, right? I mean, imagine having all that debt wiped out. It's pretty extreme. Now, unlike biblical jubilees where it was the people that got their debt forgiven, in the American jubilees that we've seen, it's basically the government stealing from one group and giving it to another. Remember the quote I always like to say, that the government cannot produce something it has not taken. So the government redistributes. So the government steals from one group, gives to another. And in order for this to happen, in order for this to occur, we need to see 4 elements. All right, we're looking for 4 different elements in place. I'm going to tell them to you, and you can see if you think these are relevant for where we're at today. So first, the wealth gap must be getting dramatically bigger. That makes sense? The division between the rich and the poor, is that getting bigger or smaller? The second thing that we're looking for is there must be cultural threats from those with different values or from like outsiders. So in other words, like a minority population and immigrants. Sounds familiar. The third thing we're looking for is that the government must be ineffective at providing solutions. And I would say that with the way the virus is being handled and the debt, I would say that's probably more true than ever. And then fourth and finally, there must be a growing anger towards the elites, like banning billionaires, maybe, things like that. If that sounds familiar, you're kind of getting it, right? Today we have the largest gap between rich and poor we've seen. We have rising protests. We have fights over immigration, race. We do have an ineffective government right now. They're not even they're not even really practicing. They're just, dealing with impeachments and the virus and things like that. And then, of course, like I said, we have the extreme dislike for the elites. Now, this is nothing new. I did a video, it might have been a year ago. It's called The Pendulum. I'll link to it up above. Highly recommend you go back and watch that. And basically, in that video, I talked about the pendulum that swings, and it was based off of a book. And so I kind of talked about the book. It's a really good book. I'd recommend to read it. And basically, it says that every 40 years, this pendulum swings from one side to the other. And so it takes 80 years round trip. And it swings from a me cycle to a we cycle. So me is about individualism. It's about me personally. A we is about collectivism, globalism. And so it shifts back and forth, back and forth. And you might have heard terms like nationalism or populism, right? Maybe you don't know what those mean. So populism would be characterized by extreme anger at the government, really at the wealthy, at the establishment, at the newcomers. Maybe that's how Trump got elected, right? Things like that. Now, Ray Dalio, I quote him all the time, one of the richest men in America, ran one of the largest funds in America, Bridgewater, and he studied all these political environments over the past 100 years. And he concluded that, he wrote this back in 2017, but after studying for over all these different political environments for over 100 years, he said the last time that populism existed as a major force in the world was back in the 1930s, and that's when most countries became populist. And they said over the last year, so this is back in 2017, that it's again started to emerge as a major force, which over the last couple of years, we've seen that, right? And so you can see, I put this chart up on the screen right here. When you see this chart, it's really easy to see that these big spikes show when populist politicians got the most votes in America and abroad. So what does all this mean? Well, it proves that what we're experiencing today is eerily similar, if not almost exactly what happened back in the 1930s. So right back then in the 1930s, right before the biggest and probably the most radical debt jubilee in all of American history, you can see on the chart on the screen, it shows the economic comparison between 1930 and now. And it's stunning when you look at it. I mean, it almost lines up perfectly. Interest rates hit zero leading up to each one of these periods. And just like in 1933, the government went into a massive money printing mode. Sound familiar? As you can see from the chart that's on the screen, the same thing happened as it did back in 1933, but this time it's way bigger, way more dramatic. And when they printed money, it went to the rich. And when they gave it to the rich, it drove up asset prices. And as you can see from these charts on the screen, this caused the stock market and other risky assets to boom during both of these periods, back in 33 and obviously now. And this boosted the wealth of the rich, but it did nothing for the poor, which is exactly why we see that gap growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, back in 1933, in order to deal with all these mounting debts, and to print money for the, all these new social programs that came out. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he closed all the banks for 4 days, and he forced Americans to turn in all the gold they owned. You might have heard about this. I know a lot of people talk about it. I talk about gold on this channel a lot. And he basically made it where every American had to turn in their gold, and they got to turn it in for $20 an ounce. Today it's about $17.50 an ounce. They turned it in for $20.67 of paper money, fake paper money. And then as soon as they did that, the government turned around and raised the price of gold. And what that did is it wiped out almost 70% of the savings of anyone that followed the rules. So he got them to turn in their gold for fake paper money and then instantly devalued their money. They lost almost 70% overnight. As you might imagine, people weren't happy about that. But he went even further. That was only the beginning. So he went on to eliminate what's known as the gold clause in all contracts. So back then, gold was still considered money. And in loans, in bonds, and other financial instruments like that, people were afraid that the government might come in and try to inflate away the value of their money, kind of like we're seeing now. And so they were afraid of that back then. And so they added this gold clause, which basically said that repayments could be required to be made in gold. So if they inflated away the money, I'd say, I don't want that fake paper. I want real gold. And that was a gold clause in that. But he took that away. And these gold clauses, they were in everything. They were in federal loans, they were in bank deposits, they were insurance contracts, private agreements, they were all over the place. And when Roosevelt outlawed the gold clause, basically what he did is he stole billions of dollars from investors. In fact, there was a Harvard paper that estimated that this one rule that he did took about $700 million a year from private investors who had bought government bonds. Billions more were stolen from folks who lost money from the elimination of the gold clause in private contracts, bank accounts, and insurance deals. Eliminating the gold clause was so controversial that investors actually sued the government, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, Roosevelt said, hey, even if they rule against me, I'm not going to recognize it. I think he swayed them, and the court ended up ruling 5-4 in Roosevelt's favor. So they didn't side with the people, they sided with the government on that one, but that's what happened. And then 40 years later, we had another debt jubilee in America. And this is in 1971. President Richard Nixon, he completely defaulted on any promise to pay gold for our foreign creditors. So at that time, the foreign creditors were still able to redeem the fake paper money for actual gold. And in 1971, he closed that window, said no more, we're defaulting on that, we're not going to give you gold anymore. And as a matter of fact, at that time, the dollar was still backed by about 25% gold. He ended that. So right away, boom, overnight, the government simply just wiped the slate clean by defaulting on their debt, just wiped it out, and nobody could redeem dollars for gold any longer. Now, in the 70s, around that time, over the next couple of years, the dollar lost about 30% of its value right over those couple of years. And inflation more than doubled. At the same time as the dollar was losing value, inflation doubled and the stock market fell almost 50% just in 2 years alone. Unemployment went sky high. It was about 10%. And believe it or not, the federal government got so desperate, check this out, got so desperate that it issued Carter bonds. Now, these were denominated in Swiss francs because the US dollar couldn't be trusted anymore. Nobody had any confidence in the dollar. And so a lot of people think that you can just default on the money and that the government backs the money by force, but force doesn't give the dollar confidence. People have to have confidence in it. Otherwise, you end up like in Venezuela where there's paper all over the street. You need to have confidence. And so at one point, the US actually had to do bonds in Swiss francs. Now, how is this going to turn out? Are we going to see a debt jubilee? I think it could be one of the only ways out of this. We don't know. But you need to be careful because the last couple times that we did see the debt jubilee, as I just illustrated for you in detail here, the last couple times the government did this, it basically made the people poor, right? They stole all the money from one group and gave it to another, very similar to what's happening today. And what do we always say? If you don't know history, you are bound to repeat it, so don't let it happen to you. Let me know what you think. Are we headed for another debt jubilee, or do we need another debt jubilee? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. That's all I got for you today. To your success, I'm out.